Is the destiny of mankind controlled by some transcendental entity or law? Is it like the hand of God hovering above? At least it is true that man has no control, even over his own will.
Despite being a dark fantasy, Berserk is more than just the violence and horror it is renowned for. Rather, what has been most endearing to me about Berserk is the sincerity with which it conveys human emotion. You wouldn't think this gruesome manga of a giant sword-wielding mercenary called Guts would overflow with emotions like love. And yet, despite being an absolute beast in battle, Guts is one of the most loving characters in the manga. In the world of Berserk, the difference between a human and a monster is love. And not love as an emotion, but love as a decision and an act of free will that goes against the logic of causality. Most every depiction of actual love in Berserk is an act of free will. The Count chooses to spare his daughter, Princess Charlotte chooses to love Griffith even after his torture, Guts and Casca decide to love each other in the absence of Griffith. In the causality of Berserk, which is the predetermined destiny that is said to be unchangeable, only love has the power to create a tiny moment of free will in the chain reaction of cause and effect. Love as an act of free will is the basis of the sacrifice. To become a monster in Berserk, you must sacrifice the thing you love because that is your attachment to free will. You can choose to go against your destiny and retain your love, or you can choose to comply with your destiny and sacrifice your love. If you can't sever your attachment to free will, then you can't become an apostle of causality. This is because choosing to save the person you love at the cost of your eternal torment is anti-causality. It goes against the cause and effect of events that led to your moment of deepest despair. The pro-causality response here is to give into your emotions of hatred, fear, and desire. To give into your destiny. People say you can't reason with emotion because emotion isn't an act of free will but the effect of a cause. If someone hurts you, you cry or you get angry. If your life is in danger, you feel fear. True transcendence in Berserk isn't complying with your destiny and becoming the God Hand, but going against your destiny and becoming a struggler. Love is anti-causality. Anti-causality is free will, and free will defies the laws of this world. Without love, Guts would have died the day he was born. The only reason he exists is because Shisu was insane after having a miscarriage. She did not act on the logic of this world, but instead chose to love this baby that was considered a bad omen. Only Shisu was willing to sacrifice herself to save Guts. This was her moment of free will, and perhaps there is truth on a supernatural scale when Gambino says that Guts caused Shisu's death. If Guts was never meant to be born according to causality, then it would make sense that Guts attracts death. His destiny, so to speak, is death, in the same way that Griffith's destiny is becoming the God Hand. Every day that Guts continues to live after the moment of his birth is a struggle against his predetermined fate. The result is that Guts becomes the living embodiment of free will in a world where causality is God. He is the wild card that should not have existed within this predetermined timeline. From the moment of his birth, he became a struggler against fate. And this is possibly important to the ultimate end of Berserk, mostly because the other character who has lost her mind is also a mother who protects her baby from certain death, that being Casca and the Moonlight Boy. There was no reason for Casca to save the demon fetus except for love, and there was no reason for Guts to listen to her except for love. This is a moment of free will that should not have existed within causality. First, because Casca should not have lived long enough to make it to the eclipse in the first place. She would have died from falling off a cliff if it weren't for Guts. If Guts didn't exist in this timeline, Casca would be dead. And secondly, because Casca should not have survived the eclipse full stop. She only survived the initial part because of Judo's love for her, and then she only survived the next part and got impregnated because of Guts' love for her and Griffith's jealousy of that. Like Griffith did that for a reason, and that reason was because Guts was watching. If Guts didn't exist in this timeline, that whole three-way situation would not have existed. Though that isn't to say the eclipse wouldn't have existed if Guts didn't exist. The eclipse would have happened regardless of whether Guts triggered Griffith's downfall or not. It was fated to happen one way or another. That presumably can't be changed. What can be changed, however, is whether the eclipse is successful or unsuccessful. We see that the Moonlight Boy has a very important connection to Griffith and to the frozen teardrop of emotion that exists within him. That teardrop of frozen love makes Griffith unable to kill Casca later on. The only reason reason that Teardrop exists is because Griffith didn't 100% complete his transformation into Femto because he didn't sacrifice Guts and Casco. He still has the tiniest little bit of humanity left in him to defy causality with. And if this theory is even remotely accurate, then the incomplete transformation of Griffith could only have existed in a timeline where Guts exists. Now here's where it gets interesting. As the character foil to Guts, Griffith is the opposite of free will. His entire existence is the result of a chain of events that ultimately set him up to fail and trigger an eclipse. Griffith is a tragic hero in the same vein as Satan from Paradise Lost. His existence calls into question whether or not the character has free will when, by the nature of his birth, he was destined to fall. The question is raised in Paradise Lost because Satan's pride causes him to revolt against God. But that pride was ultimately put there by God himself when he created Satan. Therefore, does Satan have free will when this inborn quality causes him to do everything exactly according to God's plan? The same can be said for Griffith. Does Griffith have free will when he sacrifices the Band of the Hawk if he was destined to do so from the moment of his birth? Like, it's no wonder Griffith goes off the rails when Guts leaves him. His destiny insulated him against failure from the moment of his birth. Not only has he never been abandoned in his life, but that is the very first time Griffith had lost in anything. Griffith isn't like Guts, who can suffer and still pull out on top. Rather, Griffith is the opposite. He is like his very fine sword that when it breaks, it becomes completely useless. However, I would actually argue that Golden Age Griffith does have free will. I would argue that Golden Age Griffith wasn't meant to have free will, but he ends up having free will because Golden Age Griffith has love in the plenty for exactly one person: Guts. Guts should not have existed, therefore free will should not have existed within Griffith. Griffith should not have been capable of loving any other person more than he loves his dream, but Guts became as shiny to him as his dream of his kingdom. The evidence for why I think this way is because Griffith has chosen free will before. He saved Guts from Nosferatu Zod, which risked both his life and his dream. In that moment, Griffith was willing to sacrifice himself and defy causality. If Griffith didn't do that, then Guts would have died. One way or another, it seems causality is out to kill Guts. In this case, causality is represented by Nosferatu Zod, who is the opposite force of the Skeleton Knight, who is on the side of free will. Even Casco is shocked that Griffith saved Guts because it is so outside of Griffith's inborn nature to do that. But why is Guts the only person that Griffith has love for? It was love at first sight level of attraction from Griffith. My theory is because Guts is the only person who ends up at Griffith's side based on free will. Since Guts was never meant to be alive, he isn't tied to Griffith's dream. This is exemplified when Guts just decides to get up and leave because he wants to. Nobody else in the Band of the Hawk could have done that because they all have their own internal motives that tie them to Griffith's destiny. This is demonstrated in the Campfire of Dreams. Everyone else has their own little torch that adds to Griffith's bigger flame. Guts is the only one who doesn't have his own dream to tie him up in this. Guts sees this as a loss. He sees this as he is inferior because he doesn't have his own dream. Whereas Griffith sees this as Guts is here of his own free will. Even as Griffith starts revealing the darker sides of his personality, Guts is still here of his own free will. Until Guts leaves. Where am I going with this? I believe Guts' continued existence is the sole reason Griffith still has a fragment of free will against causality. Also, by the fact that Guts is Griffith's character foil, he may be faced with the same decision of the sacrifice in the future, where he will have to choose between causality and the power to achieve his goal or revenge, or free will that is self-sacrifice, which, in a weird twist of fate, would also comply with causality since death is his ultimate fate. In conclusion, Guts is such a beast that even the god of Berserk can't kill him.